It's funny, isn't it, how some of us dream of being whisked away by the fairies, while for others, the very thought of it causes such terror as can lead to unthinkable acts. I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. In one of my earlier videos, I shared the true and absolutely terrible story of Bridget Cleary. In 1895, Bridget was killed at the hands of her husband and father as they believed that she was a fairy changeling. Their attempts to rid Bridget of the changeling resulted in her painful and horrific death. If you're not familiar with Bridget's story, please go and take a look at my earlier video. I'll leave a link at the end of this video for you. But let's go back now, almost 70 years before the death of Bridget Cleary, to the year 1826. Now, this true story, perhaps more than any other, demonstrates just how earnestly our ancestors believed in fairy changelings and the lengths that they would go to in order to rid themselves of one. Now, fair warning to you, you may find this a hard watch. This tragedy concerns another true recorded account of a death caused while trying to rid a human of a fairy changeling, this time by drowning a child of 4. Let's begin with the facts. This is the summary from the trial report of 1826. Anne Roach, an old woman of very advanced age, was indicted for the murder of Michael Leahy, a young child, by drowning him in the River Flesk. This case turned out to be a homicide committed under the delusion of the grossest superstition. The child, though 4 years old, could neither stand, walk, or speak. It was thought to be fairy-struck, and the grandmother ordered the prisoner and one of the witnesses, Mary Clifford, to bathe the child every morning in the pool of the River Flesk, where the boundaries of 3 farms meet. They had so bathed it for 3 mornings running, and on the last morning, the prisoner kept the child longer under the water than usual. When her companion, the witness Mary Clifford, said to the prisoner, "How can you hope ever to see God after this?" the prisoner replied that the sin was on the grandmother and not on her. Upon cross-examination, the witness said that it was not done with intent to kill the child, but to cure it, to put the fairy out of it. Baron Pennyfather summarised by saying, though it was a case of suspicion and required to be thoroughly examined into, the jury would not be safe in convicting the prisoner of murder, however strong their suspicions might be. The verdict was not guilty. Anne Roach was acquitted and released. That's hard reading, isn't it? Now, 4-year-old Michael Leahy was lovingly raised by his grandmother, Nora. Nora was effectively alone in this world and unable to provide the constant care that Michael required. So, using every resource she had, Nora employed a young girl to help her to care for Michael. He was her world, which makes it even more difficult to understand what could drive a loving grandmother to inflict such tortures upon her own daughter's son. But we must remember that these were very different times. When it became clear that all was not as it should be, that Michael wasn't thriving, he wasn't developing, He couldn't walk or talk or even stand. Nora felt that urgent and drastic action was required. Michael's condition was worsening with every day, such that Nora actually began hiding him away from the community. She was getting no younger herself and must have wondered how many more harsh winters that she could endure caring for her young grandson. It must have been at the forefront of her mind that if she were to become sickly or to die, Michael faced a desperately bleak future. This sense of urgency or even panic might go some way to explain why Nora turned to Anne Roach for help. Anne Roach was believed to have profound knowledge of and powerful influence with the fairies. She was respected in the community and often dispensed fairy remedies and advice. So when Nora approached Anne Roach for advice on helping her grandson, well, it set off a terrible series of events which resulted in the drowning of young Michael. On meeting Michael and discussing his poor development and physical condition with Nora, Anne declared that Michael was not himself at all, but was instead a fairy changeling. She advised Nora that in order to rid herself of the changeling and have her true grandson return to her, she must remove it with force. And the method to be used was terrifying. Anne would stand in the River Flesk at a certain point where the boundaries of 3 farms met and submerge little Michael's head under the water. This, we can suppose, was intended to frighten the changeling into revealing itself and returning to its own kind. Well, she did this for 2 mornings, and having had no result, on the 3rd morning held Michael's head under the water for longer. Michael drowned. He had not been a changeling. The real Michael had not been with the fairy folk and did not return to her on the death of the presumed changeling. Michael was dead. Nora was devastated. And Anne, well, she was arrested. To help us understand, let's look at rural Ireland of the 19th century. It was a place where people lived their lives in absolute belief and complete fear of the fairies. It was no joke. Those who might have had doubts about the existence of the fairies dared only speak their mind in trusted company, and even then only in murmurs. Such was the tangible fear that if they were heard, they might attract the attention or the wrath of the fairies. You see, even those who didn't believe couldn't dismiss the fairies altogether. They lived with a constant fear of what might happen if they were wrong. It's interesting, isn't it, that the same goes today. Almost everyone you meet will tell you that fairies are a nonsense. The fairies, no, I don't believe in them, but that doesn't mean they're not there, and it's best not to upset them anyway. I think that's called hedging your bets. The death of poor little Michael Leahy is one we should never forget. Was Anne Roach taken over by a kind of hysteria in attempting to defy the fairies? Or did she go to such extreme and brutal lengths with Michael simply to save face, to maintain her reputation in the community? It was generally accepted then, as it is now, that a person suspected of being fairy struck may be threatened with harm, but on no account subjected to pain or injury. It's believed that the fairy will retaliate with a great anger if humans were to hurt the changeling that they left behind. And further, it's feared that fairies might even hurt or kill the human in their possession, or at the very least, never return them. In fact, there are many accounts of families who have treated a suspected changeling with great love and care to improve the chances of their loved one being returned to them. The subject of changelings is fraught with contradictions and danger, and for poor Bridget Cleary and Michael Leahy, absolute tragedy. If you'd like to discover or even revisit the true story of Bridget Cleary, check out my video that's on screen now. I feel it's so important that their stories, the stories of Bridget and Michael, are never forgotten. If you agree and would like me to keep these true stories alive, please support the channel in any way you can. Subscribe, hit that like button, or check out the other ways to support in the notes below. It's been a tough video, hasn't it? I appreciate you sticking with me. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!